Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. I get to talk about the Great Ace Attorney Adventures today, with preview embargo having been lifted on the upcoming 2-pack re-release of 3DS titles to Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4 and PC. Now in this video I'm going to show you footage from the first case of the first game, but I'm not really going to talk about these games because I don't think there's much point, not at preview stage. It is Ace Attorney, and if you've played them before, then you know what you're getting into with this one. It just has a different set of characters. If you haven't played them before, then you're probably still aware of how they play, because these are perhaps the most famous visual novels of all, or you can call them adventure games, whatever you call them. They're very well known at this point. So instead, I'm going to talk about the context of these games, because they take place during what is an absolutely fascinating period of Japanese history, and it is one that is generally not talked about today, or if it is dealt with incredibly poor nuance. However, I do think that knowing the context of these games does make them all the more interesting, because while they're certainly not historically accurate stories, the context is there. The games do drop in some real historical figures, and the relationship between England and Japan as the games depict, as well as various other nations that are name-dropped as well, provides a real-world and real history context and foundation for a lot of the overarching narrative in these games. Now, I do have to be careful in this video because there are some significant sensitivities around the Meiji era, which is the era that these games depict, the Meiji era or Victorian era over in England. And if you tap around on the internet, you're already going to find some discourse about imperialistic Japan with relationship to these games. Now, I would be amazed if anybody who actually played these games came away still thinking that they were a defense of imperialistic Japan, particularly when they spend a lot of time being set in England anyway. But then this is the games industry, and the amazing is liable to happen pretty much every time. So I would not be surprised at the end if there is some discourse about this stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if that discourse finds its way to this video. So, as a disclaimer up front, I am in no way defending anything that I describe here. I do think it is worthwhile to understand the actual history of what actually went on and why it happened. But, yes, Imperial Japan was not good. Let's just get that out of the way up front. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, here's a very brief history lesson. If you find any of what I say interesting, I highly recommend that you read a book called Japan's Story by Christopher Harding, which describes at great depth the social, cultural and political movements that occurred within Japan from the 19th century onwards. I think it's an enormously useful introduction to the last 180 years or so of Japanese history, and I'll actually be referring to that book in this video as well. I will link to it in the description below this video. I do recommend everybody with an interest in Japan read it because it will help you to understand the country and the culture. So anyway, in 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry, no, not the Friends actor, a different Matthew Perry, was given the task of convincing Japan to open its borders. The country had been in a period of self-isolation for 200 years prior to that, and Japan's location was bothering the traders from America that wanted to take advantage of all the opportunities that Asia in particular provided. Perry decided to go about his task by arriving at Japan in massive warships and threatening to blow up the country if it didn't give America what it wanted. America has always enjoyed that form of diplomacy, and you definitely saw that in 1853. Japan did give America what it wanted. It opened its borders, and for the first time in 200 years, it looked out into the world. What Japan realized very quickly was that it was in trouble. Europe was busy carving up Asia to grow its empires. America had just demonstrated to Japan directly what it is willing to do, and Japan, from having been isolated, realized that it was now hopelessly outgunned. Following a brief civil war to put down the last elements that wanted to resist the Americans, Japan fully opened its borders and set about modernizing, which it did so fast. And this is where I will quote part of Harding's book, because it does explain in another person's words, not mine, what was going through the Japanese mindset at the political level at that point in time. So, as Harding wrote, a guiding principle was established: Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the state, strengthen the military. Japan had to avoid being next after once mighty China on Western colonialism's to-do list, and must secure revision of the humiliating international trading agreements now widely disparaged as unequal treaties. The new Japanese state and its story were to be forged in an atmosphere, if not of outright panic, then of acute anxiety mixed with powerful and urgent determination. So basically, what Harding is referring to there is that Japan decided to emulate what Europe was doing to the rest of the world. This meant it was going to adopt Western aesthetics, so the Meiji era and then the Taisho era which followed it were a fascinating time where fashion and art sat somewhere in the middle as Japan grappled with the traditional and the new. You had people doing all kinds of interesting experiments with suits. The school uniforms came through at that point and they looked very military-like. The military uniforms themselves were adapted from Western fashions, and you still see a lot of that today. I mean, those sailor uniforms that are so popular in anime and other forms of media actually can be derived from way back then. On top of that, Japan dismantled the military government, giving power back to the emperor, but also establishing a civilian government to advise. It embraced manufacturing, industrialization, and a market economy, understanding that those things, which it didn't have previously, were all required if it was going to be able to withstand being colonized. And now, to get to the really unpleasant bit here, Japan also saw the need to become a colonial power of its own. Japan saw what was happening with the Europeans and realized that a lot of their power came from their colonies, and if Japan was to become a world power, then surely it needed to and was entitled to become a colonial power of its own. This need, in the Japanese mindset, was really driven home when, after World War I, the five great powers that were left, they being the US, England, Italy, France, and Japan, formed a council as the world leaders. Now, as the only non-Western member in that council, Japan moved a proposal of racial equality, probably figuring out that as the odd one out, it needed to do something about that. But that got voted down because England was worried about immigration from China and Japan, and Australia, because of course where racism is, Australia is not far behind, was lobbying hard for England to allow it to keep its obscenely racist White Australia policy in action. Now again, I have to emphasize that I am in no way defending what Japan did to mainland Asia at the time in its quest to become a superpower, but anybody who thought that Europe and America was looking at Japan with benevolence is being very disingenuous. Japan was, at best, tolerated as a problem that was too powerful to directly deal with. The way that they went about protecting their sovereignty was horrific, and again, I'm not defending it, but so too was how the world powers were treating their colonies, and Japan really did have every reason to be terrified about their sovereignty and becoming a colonized power. And so all of that is the context for the Great Ace Attorney, which takes place in this period of explosive growth, modernization at light speed, and a desperation by the Japanese to learn about the world from the powers that owned most of it. The fawning concern over the relationship with England and the obsession with the beauty of the English that we see in the very first chapter, which you've probably seen on the screen in front of you as you've been watching this video, is funny. The game presents it as something that is very funny because just the way that it's framed, it's very funny. But at the same time, it's actually far less exaggerated than you might have otherwise thought. And that's why it's important, or useful anyway, to know about the historical context. It does put a lot of what happens in this game in context. So later on in these games, you'll meet the quintessentially English character of Sherlock Holmes, who has been renamed as Herlock Sholmes for copyright reasons. And you'll also get to bump into Japan's greatest writer of the era, and perhaps ever, Soseki. Knowing the historical and cultural background to this era will help you immerse yourself within these really cracking narrative-based games and really enjoy the characters, the setting, the kind of vibrancy of the whole game. it becomes a lot more colourful if you know the background and what's kind of underneath it, what was going on at the time, and the kind of the era, the period that this game depicts. And that's why I certainly recommend that you read this book, Japan's Story by Christopher Harding, before playing this game. You read the book and you will definitely have a better understanding of what this game's about, and you will appreciate it that much more. So anyway, that is enough for this video. I am going to have a full review of the games themselves up on digitallydownloaded.net come review time. But my preview impressions are basically that it's great. If you like Ace Attorney, you're going to love what these two games promise. So thank you as always for tuning in. If you've enjoyed this video, do mash that like and subscribe button. I do like to talk around games on this channel, so you get to a bit of context beyond the actual kind of review of the game itself. So if it is interesting, do follow me, and I do a lot more of these. If you want to support what I'm doing as well and are feeling generous, you can back me on Patreon for $1 a month or more if you are feeling particularly generous. Doing so actually helps both this channel, the digitally downloaded website, and it helps me to produce various other things as well, like visual novels and a magazine, which goes out to Patreon backers. It's a pretty good deal for just $1 a month. Alright, that is enough of this video. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments, and we will see you next time.